I'm going to hand it over to Paul Allen. I want to introduce him first. He has actually founded many companies, not just Ancestry.com, which is why you really know him the best. And so he's done all this work, and then he actually joined Gallup. And he worked with Gallup for 5 years as a global strengths advisor and strengths evangelist, and has brought the strengths message to like hundreds of audiences, if not more, and worked with strengths experts for years. And he's just very fluent in strengths. And so he's going to tell you, like, how in the world did he come to then found a company called SOAR. He has a very close relationship with Gallup, and so I am just very grateful that he's here, and I want you to give him a warm welcome, Paul Allen.
Thank you, Colleen.
You're welcome.
Pleasure to be here with all of you. I love being around startup entrepreneurs. Having been a startup entrepreneur for 30 years, I remember well the journey. I knew nothing at all when I got started. And I'm not exaggerating that. I grew up in a home where my mom was an educator, my dad was a professor, and I never once in my life thought about being an entrepreneur, being in business. That was just not on my radar. I have learner number 1, which means I loved all my school subjects, and when I went to college, every subject I took, I wanted to major in that. So I changed my major several times. Finally ended up as a Russian major, graduated in 1990 with a bachelor's degree in Russian. And so I never had a business class in my life. I never had a technology class in my life. My dad bought an Apple II computer for me when I was 12 to get me to stop playing Dungeons and Dragons full time. I was a full-time D&D fanatic for like a year and a half. I've never binge watched anything until Stranger Things came out, and my wife said, "You just have to watch one episode." I watched it, I'm like, that was me in the 70s. We watched the entire season in 2 seasons in 3 days. So my dad bought me the computer thinking if I could distract Paul from all of his game stuff. Well, the first program I wrote was a football simulation where I got to call the plays and watch what happened, randomizing pass completion or how many yards, first down, touchdown. And my team always won. That was cool. And then my second program, my biggest achievement of my coding career was a 2,800 line Dungeons and Dragons program on the Apple II computer. But thankfully I quit Dungeons and Dragons cold turkey in 9th grade, and I've never played since. So I want to introduce myself and give you a chance to just ask me maybe 4 or 5 questions about my background. And so here's a few things that kind of have something, I kind of already spoiled the Dungeons and Dragons thing, so don't bring that up. But any of those items have any interest to you as I... Occupy Wall Street, okay. So 2008 global financial crisis, devastating to so many people, including in the greatest generation, who had done everything they had been told to do: work hard, save money, retire. And many of my neighbors had very big bank accounts that were cut in half with no fault of their own because the global financial crisis and the financial system was so fragile. So I got obsessed for about 2 years. I watched every C-SPAN hearing on the global financial crisis. I read dozens of books. I made trips to Washington, D.C. to listen to the Dodd-Frank hearings on fixing Wall Street. And I was obsessed with this. And the media was, always, the media is the media. And you never know what you can trust from any interview or from any broadcast or from any piece of journalism. You just don't know what to trust. And so Occupy Wall Street started happening, and I didn't want to judge the people in Occupy Wall Street by reading about them. So I went to Occupy Wall Street multiple times to talk to the people that were trying to organize Wall Street reform and saying it's not acceptable what's going on. And so I just think that Occupy Wall Street thing indicates that what I like to do is form my own opinions about the world by talking to people and listening to people and learning directly from the source, and not try to trust what's on the airwaves. Okay, that's my Occupy Wall Street thing. Decorporation. Okay, wow. So I actually believe, when my great-grandfather was born in 1842, I actually have, very close, like, my dad was born in 1931, my grandfather was born in 1894, my great-grandfather was born in 1842. Do you know back then there were no corporations? Except a very few that were created by parliaments and monarchs. You've heard of the East Indies Trading Company. It was a company, it was a corporation. You've heard of the Hudson Bay Company. It was formed by the Queen or the Parliament because the only way you could form a corporation was with the government doing it. And the Hudson Bay Company once owned, I think, 1/10 of all the land on the planet. It was a monopoly where if you owned it, you could get all the fur, and you could do the trapping, you could get the lumber, everything, all the natural resources. So it was a monopoly. So when our great-great-grandparents were around, you owned things, but you didn't have a corporation that could live forever and have an unlimited amount of acquisition. We live in a world where there are trillion-dollar corporations owned by a handful of people. This is unbelievable. The founding fathers didn't know about corporations because they didn't exist. The founding fathers of this country created something called patent law, which was if you invent something, we want to reward you for that invention. We give you a short-term monopoly of that invention. You get to monetize that for 17 years. Nobody can copy it. And then it expires. And it turns into a public domain common good for the welfare of everybody. Now, that 17-year monopoly has been enough to motivate inventors and scientists and innovators for hundreds of years to create all the amazing things that we have today. But corporations started existing in like the 1850s and 60s, railroads, oil companies, mining companies, and they all wanted monopolies, right? So you get these big trusts that are buying up, just like those Hudson Bay. The corporations like to maximize profits, and they like to have acquisitions and get monopolies. Why? So then they can raise prices, and then they can get very wealthy. So corporations, to me, are a problem because you have a few people owning corporations worth trillions. You have, in Silicon Valley, you've heard about unicorn companies that become worth $1 billion. In 2013, when that word was coined, there were 19 unicorn companies. Now there's 400. Minting a $1 billion company is easier than ever before. And $1 billion companies turn into $10 billion companies, turn into $100 billion companies. They all want to be a monopoly. So Uber probably will be a $1 trillion company someday. And then it will put out of work its millions of drivers because they can do self-driving cars. They can use robots and AI to provide the transportation. So they need the drivers now, but they don't need the drivers long term. So my hope is, have you heard of a B Corporation? Anyone? Okay. Invented in 2009 by Maryland. The governor, Martin O'Malley, I met him for 3 hours one night, and he was telling me about the history of B Corporation. So a B Corporation is a socially conscious organization that allows you to not maximize profit at the expense of people or the environment. And so I think B corporations are the best type of corporation today. But you could still have a B corporation that becomes worth $1 trillion and makes a few people 10 million, 10 billion, 100 billionaires, and the rest of society doesn't get the economic benefit of that. So part of our vision for SOAR is not only to build a company that helps human beings discover their talents and reach their full potential, but if we build a unicorn company, or even bigger, 10 billion, 100 billion, we hope to build one of the world's most valuable companies, but we want to convert it to what we call a D corporation, which means distributed ownership of the corporation, which means you have a blockchain that says everyone that owns every share in this company, and you have an algorithm that prevents any one human being from owning more than, let's say, 1/10,000th of this company. So what you end up with is a permanent distributed ownership model for corporations. That's our hope. It's like a moonshot. But in terms of the world's biggest problem right now, one of them is increasing inequality. The rich keep getting richer, the poor keep getting poorer, and it's going to happen even more with robots and AI taking jobs. If you've ever read Kurt Vonnegut's first novel, 1952, it's called Play Your Piano. He was the first novelist in history to anticipate a future era where robots and machines took over all the human jobs. And if you read his book in 52 and see, that's kind of the path that we're heading on. So we actually need to reinvent corporations so that the ownership doesn't just go to the very top. Long story, but I was in Russia a month ago for the first time in my life, even though I was a Russian major in college. And when Boris Yeltsin and Gorbachev kind of dismantled the Soviet Union and tried to create capitalism and democracy for a very small period of time, there was a lot of hope, if you can remember that. The wall came down, and the East, the communist empire kind of collapsed, and all of a sudden, privatization and democracy and all these cool things might happen. Well, guess what happened? Boris Yeltsin distributed shares of the corporations to every citizen in the country. Kind of a cool move, right? But they didn't know what the stock was even worth. They had these worthless pieces of paper because they didn't understand corporations or the value. So these middlemen ran through the country buying up all the shares for pennies on the dollar, and now there's like 100 oligarchs that are all billionaires. So it was a nice attempt, but it failed. And you ended up with the oligarchs who now run the country with Putin. All right, you have a comment or a question?
Have you done much work with the ESOP corporation?
Love that. Employee stock option and employee stock ownership, Winco. My favorite model of a corporation in the world today is something called the John Lewis Partnership. Has anyone heard of the John Lewis Partnership? I had not either. I've only met like one person in the United States that has heard of the John Lewis Partnership, because we celebrate the Bill Gates, the Michael Dells, the Mark Zuckerberg. We celebrate these, Jeff Bezos, the billionaire, trillion-dollar company creators. We celebrate them. We don't celebrate this incredible guy in the UK in the 1940s named John Speeden Lewis. His father built a retail company. He grew it to 14,000 employees, and then he gave them all ownership, all as equal partners. And here we are 70 years later, there's 88,000 partners in the John Lewis Partnership. And they all run retail stores. Imagine if Walmart was owned by 2.2 million workers instead of the 5 Walton heirs. You imagine the world changing thing if we restructured corporations. Now, you can't go retroactively say, hey, we're gonna take over all the corporations and distribute shares to all citizens. That's not the American way, right? But what you can do is create a new model, like a B corporation that spreads to thousands of social entrepreneurs, or maybe a D corporation idea, which says, for a few years I can benefit and get rich from my company, but in the long run, it will be distributed to all my employees, to my customers, and we'll build an economic engine that's good for everybody. Sorry, that was a super long answer. You guys are not here to listen to an economic history lesson or anything crazy like that. But I think Occupy Wall Street inspired me to try to imagine a different kind of world of corporations. One more, and then we'll move into the Bill and Ted. I don't know. Dublin. So on my bucket list of things to do in life was to go to the UK and drive a car on the wrong side of the road with a passenger side steering wheel. So last October, I got to go speak to 500 Google employees in their leadership development program. And I flew into Dublin. There was a tropical storm, and it was like the airplane had to stay on the tarmac for like we couldn't hardly even get to the gate. Finally, we got to the gate. The rain was pouring. I found out that all the hotel rooms in Dublin were sold out, and I'm like, okay. So I went to a car rental place, and I thought I could rent a car and drive like 50 kilometers out of the city to go get a hotel. Finally, I realized they were charging me like hundreds of dollars a day for a car. I'm like, don't you have anything cheaper? They said, well, we have a stick shift. I'm like, okay, I'll take it. So I took a cheap stick shift in a tropical storm throughout Dublin, throughout 50 kilometers. And literally, I almost died twice getting run over by a diesel truck. Thankfully, I had my Google Maps on my phone speaking to me, because like when you're like, and it was a stick shift, like it was so, I was really dumb. I shouldn't have done that. But that bucket list thing is off my list. So,
All the way up.
yeah, all the way off. Okay, let's move on. Okay, this is really not supposed to be about me. It's supposed to be about you. Well, these are my grandkids. I have 4 grandkids. I have 8 kids and 4 grandkids. And I think if any of you are a parent or a grandparent, you realize that it's a life-changing experience to see this precious baby brought into the world with unlimited potential, with you have a natural love for this child. You don't know where it came from, but there's nothing like it. And we need to build a world that allows children to grow and reach their full potential. The word culture is interesting. So we're going to talk a little bit about strengths-based leadership, strengths-based culture. But the word culture, think about the word agriculture. Okay? It's the study of growing plants, Agriculture is about growth. Culture is related to the word cultivate, another growth-oriented word. And so what we really need to do is have a culture in our homes and in our schools and in our places of work and in our places of worship that is all designed around understanding your innate talents and gifts and cultivating the best growth opportunities we possibly can for every one of our brothers and sisters, every one of the human beings that grace this planet. Instead of having institutions and corporations that are all designed to maximize outcomes that aren't healthy and aren't good for the rest of us. So I believe in trying to reinvent corporations and schools and workplaces around growth culture. And that starts with an identification of your unique talents and gifts. Here's my granddaughter, Beth. This is the first time I've included her in a slideshow, but what a little angel, just a little doll. Okay, so now I want to shift the attention to you and your personality and your traits. And so we're going to do a quick little activity. But before we do that, I just want to read one little quote. It's by a great educator who said that education is primarily about ourselves. For example, we study medicine to learn how to keep ourselves well physically. Through the studies of the mind, psychology, and psychiatry, we learn how to keep ourselves well mentally. Agriculture is how we feed ourselves. The social studies teach us to live together successfully. We study law to try to keep ourselves out of trouble. Then we have this important field of religion, by use of which we look out for our spiritual welfare. The biggest problems involved in any of these fields center in us. Probably the thing that we know less about than anything else in the world is our own individual selves. You can ask people many questions about science, invention, or history, and they will answer you. But if you ask them to write out an analysis of him or herself, to tell you about his or her mind and soul qualities, if you ask them how they became the kind of person they are, you may not get very good answers. The great Peter Drucker, the greatest management thinker of the last 50 years, said, if you ask an American what their strengths are, they'll answer you with a blank stare. Or they'll answer in terms of subject matter expertise, which is not the right answer. Peter Drucker also said, never appoint someone to be manager if they focus on the weaknesses of their employees. It sucks the life out of the company when you're obsessed with what people are doing wrong. If you have a performance review at the end of the year, you've hit all your goals, and your manager gives you 5 minutes of kudos, and then 55 minutes of, what you could really work on next year, and people really hate working with you because you can't do this, this, and this. Can you focus on fixing those things? That's kind of the traditional workplace feedback loop, and it's very detrimental to human growth, to human confidence, to self-efficacy. Gallup has just published a new business book. In one day, this became the fastest selling business book of all time. If you want to benefit from decades of Gallup's research about human talent, about employee engagement, about leadership and culture, I highly advise you to check out this. It's more of a reference book than a quick read. It's got 50 plus chapters, and you can look it up to see what do Gallup's latest studies show about how to interact with your employees, how to build high-performing teams in a growth culture. So I highly recommend that.
What's it called?
It's called It's the Manager. And okay, so quick activity. Please be prepared to stand up and sit down quickly, so you might have to undo the table setting on your desk. And we're going to just kind of show you the wide range of personal traits that we all have. None of us are the same. We're all very unique, and it's important to understand those uniquenesses. All right, so let's figure out what energizes each of you. Stand up if you always talk to people in elevators, airplanes, stores, and wherever you go. Someone in the back's raising their hand. Okay, so about 20% of you. Now, those of you sitting down, do you like sitting next to these folks on airplanes? I put on my headphones as a barrier, and you guys break through. Somehow you're able to start a conversation. Now, at the end of the 2-hour conversation, I honestly think I'm so glad you broke the ice. So thank you for having this great outgoing personality trait. I don't have it, and I do try to protect myself from it, but I'm always grateful. I'm always grateful when you get through it. Stand up if you make a list of things to do every day and you stick to that list. Okay. So quite a few that are outcome-focused achievers. Now, stay standing if you do it on weekends. And stay standing if you do it on holidays. Okay, you guys, it's hard to imagine that people do that, right? My daughter, go ahead and sit down. My daughter, when we go to Hawaii or when we go on vacation, she's like, my wife is like, Becca, why don't you sleep in and relax and enjoy your vacation? And she says, I feel so much better when I get up at 5:30, I go do my running and I make my list of things to do that day. So we always project our own interests and things we like and things we don't like. You know there's a television show called Dirty Jobs? Okay, do you know that almost every dirty job that's ever featured, somebody loves to do that? They get great inward satisfaction from doing that. One of my stories at Gallup was my friend Haley was well known for being super organized and very put together. Another friend at work had a disastrous apartment. Everyone was like, she just couldn't organize anything. So finally she got up the courage to ask Haley to come over to her apartment and help her clean. 6 hours later, it was perfect. The next week, everyone's excited about hearing the story, and nobody was surprised that Haley pulled off a miracle, but a great makeover of that apartment. But what surprised everyone is Haley's highlight for the week in the company newsletter was being invited by her friend to clean her apartment. Haley loved every minute of it. I have a friend whose favorite hobby is to help people move. He says it's real-world Tetris. He goes in and he photographs all their stuff, and he looks at the hallway, he looks at the route to their new place, and he gets great satisfaction from doing that. I'm like, God bless you, because that's the last thing I want to do. So let's not impose our own selves or project our own selves on other people. The thing we hate the most, someone else may get a great satisfaction from doing it, and they may do it very, very well. Okay, stand up if you need to pick someone to race while he's driving, or at the gym on the treadmill. You're always like, outrun that person. So a little competition. You do your best work when you have competition. Go ahead and sit down. Stand up if you like to seek out a familiar face at a party. So many of you feel like you're more comfortable with those that you already know. Now some of you go to parties and you work the crowd. And you're going to chat it up with as many people as you can and get satisfaction from doing that. Go ahead and sit down. Stand up if you tend to be skeptical until you're given proof. Yeah. You want facts. You want data. You just don't want to take somebody's word for it just because they said so. Okay, go ahead and sit down. I think we'll run through the next couple. Stand up is my favorite one. Stand up if you have a color-coded or otherwise organized office closet. Sorry. And does anyone want to volunteer their organization scheme? You would like to?
I love mine because it's one of my only organized spots in my life. But it's color and texture.
Ooh, color and texture. Very advanced. Level 5. Okay. Stand up if you push the elevator button multiple times to remind you that you're there. You are ready to get to work. You don't want anything to slow you down. Okay, cool. All right. Stand up if you love to speak in public, at work, at church, or in your community. You love to be asked to speak in public. Okay, now, the conventional wisdom, what have we heard about? What do humans fear more than death? Public speaking. Now, why do some of you love it? Again, we're projecting our own fears, and we're ignoring the fact that some people get a big kick and great satisfaction from being asked to speak in public. So thank you. Thank you all of you. Doesn't that show how different we are all from each other? And I bet nobody stood up and sat down for the same things. Like, if you compared yourself to others in the room, you're very unlikely to find somebody that was, the same as you in all 13 of those. All right. Yeah. So, ideally, I won't make you do this because we're going to be short on time. But ideally, if we help Don Clifton fulfill his vision of a world that's built on the strengths of each person, and if parents help children understand their unique gifts, and if schools and places in education can help people develop their gifts into strengths, instead of well-roundedness, standardized curriculum, standardized testing, we try to kind of fill everybody's minds with the same stuff, the same year. Like, I don't know who invented this system, but it's detrimental to most humans. Some humans thrive in that environment and do really well. Most people don't. The longer you're sitting in a school classroom, the more disengaged you get, according to Gallup's free student poll that is taken by over 1 million students per year. First grade, fifth grade, high engagement. 9th grade, less. 12th grade, even less. Workplace engagement, even less. What kind of world do we live in where our institutions and organizations beat the life out of us year after year after year, instead of living life to a crescendo where we get to discover what we are good at, we get to do more of it, we get rewarded and recognized for doing what we love and what we're good at, and the world benefits because we're at our best. We need to reinvent a lot of institutions to get to that different kind of outcome. All right. Okay. So I mentioned, or Dr. Freud. I want to read a quote from Dr. Sigmund Freud. He had a huge impact on the world of psychology for decades. He still does. And I want to read to you what Freud wrote about how he feels about people. And then ask yourself this question. Do I want to subscribe to any of the theories of Dr. Sigmund Freud? Here's his quote. I have found little that is good about human beings in the whole. In my experience, most of them are trash. No matter whether they publicly subscribe to this or that ethical doctrine or to none at all. Freud studied sick people and he was sick himself. And he came up with a lot of theories that have had a big impact on hundreds of millions of people. Dr. Don Clifton is a counterexample of a psychologist who, instead of studying what was wrong and how people were sick and how they got screwed up, he obsessed for 50 years to look for little glimpses, little clues of talent and potential. He came up with this beautiful taxonomy of hundreds of talents. He boiled them down to the 34 that Colleen showed you. And Don Clifton invented another theory in 1970. He called it the dipper and the bucket. Now think about Freud kind of despising people, and think about Don Clifton with this concept. The dipper in the bucket says, every human being on earth has a bucket and a dipper. And every interaction you have with another human being either fills their bucket or empties it. And the best way to have a full bucket is to fill up everybody's buckets around you. Now that was 1970. He coined that metaphor. It started spreading to schools and workplaces. Millions and millions of people are now taught how to be a bucket filler. One of the first things you learn to fill someone's bucket is know their name and know the name that they like to be called by. And when you pass them in the hallway at school or at work, you call them by their name because that's an indication that you care about them as a human being. It turns out 15% of people go to work every day and they're not called by the name they prefer to be called by. 15%. Many people ignore people at work because it's kind of a cold, hard, cruel world out there, and we check our humanity at the door, and we become like cogs in a machine. And I think Dr. Clifton has done more than anyone in the last 50 years to change the way we can view each other in the workplace. We should fill each other's buckets constantly, and we should always look at each other through the lens of what are our strengths, what are our talents, what role could this person excel in. And so I'm a huge fan of the new theory of Dr. Don Clifton, building a world and institutions based on the strengths of each person. I actually think that Dr. Clifton's theories help us live what I would call the second great commandment, to love your neighbor as yourself. And in a modern, complex world, these tools are being embraced by large corporations and by big education institutions, not because of their religious connotation, because it is not a religious thing, but it actually does allow you to treat each other with dignity and love people for the strengths that they have, the talent and the contribution that they can bring. All right, so I believe, and I've heard coaches say this, people that are caught up in the strengths movement like I am, that if we could all share this philosophy of looking at each other through the lens of strengths and having incredible language to describe the unique talents of each person, as we do that, we can fulfill Dr. King's vision of a world where we're not judging people by the color of their skin or their outward appearance, but by the content of their character, their unique talents, their gifts that we all need. I really believe this can accelerate the reality of Dr. King's vision. I have to skip a few more things. Just another thing about focusing on what's right. It's not easy. You want to fix your kids all the time, right? You want to fix your coworkers all the time. You're bugged and annoyed by so many people and their behavior and their attitudes and how they act. And it's hard because people are very different from one another. But when you put on these glasses that are the strength finder lens, and you stop looking at the surface and you start looking inside and you start understanding, oh, this person's not very talkative, not because they want to annoy me, but because they have deliberative. And they are very, very thoughtful before they speak because they don't want to make a misstep, because they're very risk averse. And people with deliberative are extremely valuable in avoiding risk and helping organizations not make big mistakes. So they might be very slow to make a decision, but they make very good decisions. So just because you're annoyed by them in the short run, you might need to realize in the long run, they'll save your butt. And you'll probably avoid going to jail because this deliberative person set up a framework that helps you guys avoid stepping on a landmine. So each of the 34 is so complex, and you have to become fluent in strengths for it to really come to life. Our lead investor, Graham Weston, a billionaire from San Antonio, Texas. Have you ever heard of Rackspace? The managed hosting company, cloud computing company. He sold it for $4.2 billion a couple years ago. It's the most strengths-based company in the world, in my opinion. And Graham is so fluent in the 34 themes. All 7,000 employees at Rackspace not only took the test or the assessment, but they wore their top 5 strengths on their badge, their security badge, which meant it was visible all the time, which meant every time you were in a meeting with anybody, you're looking at their strengths. Do you know how that affected the culture? Do you know that hundreds of executives at Rackspace are so fluent in strengths, they know exactly what role to put you in, where you can thrive. Every team they build is built on the complementary strengths of each other. Now, strengths is a language. How many of you have learned a foreign language before? Were you fluent on day one? How long does it take to become fluent in a foreign language? Spanish is 600 hours, according to the State Department. Russian is 2,400 hours, according to the State Department. So it's years, okay? It's a lot of time, and it's a lot of practice. What we found in studies is that students who take StrengthsFinder, and this year 700,000 college students in the United States will take StrengthsFinder, 700,000, that when they have 6 or more conversations about strengths with their friends, their advisors, their teachers, their GPAs go up, their re-enrollment numbers skyrocket, and their relationship with their roommates and their teachers improves. but it takes 6 to 10 conversations. Now, I wouldn't call that fluency, but it's a good start. Imagine 100 conversations. Imagine 1,000 conversations. Imagine where you start to see everybody through the lens of strengths, where you walk past someone who's homeless, and your first thought is, I wonder what strengths that person has that they never discovered. I went to Texas, Fort Worth, Texas, my first trip as a Gallup employee, and I met a coach named Debbie Kratke, and her job as a social worker and workforce development professional was to help 500 ex-offenders come out of Texas prisons after 1 to 30 years in prison and help them find a job, help them with re-entry. And she had been doing things like this for years and found that almost every assessment that the state or the federal government required her to give to these people made them feel even worse about themselves than they already did. Oh, your reading skills are at, 2nd grade level. You are 5 percentile in this, skill. And they already know they've messed up. And they've served time for it. And they don't have much to hope for, right? These coaches put together a 2-week strengths coaching course to help these young and old ex-offenders to believe in themselves again. Debbie, Jan, and 3 other coaches would spend 2 weeks with them, helping them become fluent in their own strengths and helping them learn how to interview and say, I have responsibility. What that means is, I will do this, this, and this. Then the coaches would go into the employer and offer this candidate and say, they will be a good employee if you let them play to their strengths. And by the way, we'll subsidize the job. We'll pay for them for the first 2 months. And we'll pay 50% for the second 2 months. If you like this employee after the 4 months is up, you can keep them. And at the end of this next step program, 83% of these people kept their full-time job. Only 7% went back to jail. It's one of the most successful programs, I think, in the history of justice or the penal system that we have, which isn't very just. And it's because they help these people believe in themselves and they help the employer see the good in them rather than the flaws in them. And so I believe that the world can be transformed one person at a time, one conversation at a time, if we all accept this invitation, which I've accepted and many others are accepting, which is, let's become fluent in the language of strengths. Let's become fluent in what's right with each other. Let's become talent spotters. Let's see potential in everyone around us and call it out. See something, say something. But I'm talking about really good things. It turns out that I wish I could tell some of these stories, but I'm going to just show you one thing. The greatest single talent, according to Tom Rath, he is Don Clifton's grandson. He's a best-selling author. I think he sold over 10 million copies of books. Tom Rath said this, and I truly believe it, that the greatest talent of all is spotting talent in someone else that they hadn't seen before. How many of you have a 4th grade teacher, 6th grade teacher, they said something about what you were good at? You still remember it 10, 20, 30, 50 years later. How many of you have that kind of a person in your life that helped you see what you could do and believe in yourself? Okay, the world needs a huge dose of this right now. We need to stop staring at screens, stop watching fake news, and what we need to do is re-engage with each other as human beings and start spotting what's right with us. It really is the time to do that. And I believe that with dozens of strengths coaches in North Carolina already, you can invite people like Colleen to come to your workplace, to introduce you to the language, the tool, to start those conversations happening. You can do it at home. There's a book called Strengths-Based Parenting. There's a book called Strengths-Based Marriage. There's a great book called Strengths-Based Leadership that teaches you how to lead with your strengths and how to lead people based on their strengths. So every one of us will read that book differently. I'll look up my 5 strengths and I'll read what it says. Then I'll look up the strengths of my coworkers and I'll read what it says about how do I lead them. So it's totally personalized. It's super effective when you personalize advice instead of just giving one-size-fits-all advice or standardized whatever. Like, let's play to each other's strengths. So I invite you, ladies and gentlemen, to join the strengths movement. Talk to Colleen, get a business card, go to Gallup's websites and take the assessment, buy a book, StrengthsFinder 2.0, Strengths-Based Leadership, Strengths-Based marriage, strengths-based parenting. There's a nice movement going on, but it's just not very well known. And I don't scale very well. I can go to dozens of cities and have audiences like this, but someday tens of millions of people need to learn about this online, on YouTube, with stories that are being told, and that's kind of what SOAR's aiming for. I'm really thankful for the chance to come here. I really believe in people, and I believe that the most important thing in the universe is each of us, that we were created and that we are the reason that everything else exists. And if we could just treat each other with love and respect, if we could help each other grow and develop, this becomes a more beautiful world for everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you.